Romans chapter 3 is a pivotal passage in Paul's epistle to the Romans, addressing the core issues of sin, the law, and righteousness. The chapter continues Paul's argument from the previous chapters, emphasizing the universality of sin and the inadequacy of the law for achieving righteousness. Paul begins by addressing the advantages of the Jews, acknowledging their privileged position as recipients of God's revelations. However, he quickly pivots to the theme of God's faithfulness, asserting that human unfaithfulness does not nullify the faithfulness of God. The chapter then transitions to a comprehensive indictment of human sinfulness, drawing on Old Testament scriptures to demonstrate that both Jews and Gentiles are under the power of sin. This section underscores the impossibility of attaining righteousness through the law, as the law's primary function is to make humanity aware of sin. In the final section, Paul introduces the concept of righteousness through faith. He reveals that God's righteousness is now manifested apart from the law, accessible to all who believe in Jesus Christ. This groundbreaking declaration highlights that justification is a gift of grace, made possible through Christ's redemptive work. Consequently, boasting is excluded, affirming that God is the God of all people, regardless of ethnic or religious background. Romans chapter 3 thus lays the theological groundwork for understanding justification by faith, a central tenet of Christian doctrine, and sets the stage for the subsequent exploration of faith and salvation in the following chapters. Outline of Romans chapter 3. God's faithfulness, verses 1 to 8. All are under sin, verses 9 to 20. Righteousness through faith, verses 21 to 31. Let's study each section of the chapter. The first section, Romans chapter 3 verses 1 to 8, God's faithfulness. Let's read verses 1 to 2. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or, what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Paul begins this section by posing a rhetorical question about the advantage of being a Jew and the value of circumcision. This question arises naturally from the preceding discussion in chapter 2, where Paul argued that mere possession of the law or physical circumcision does not guarantee righteousness before God. Despite this, Paul affirms that there is indeed an advantage. The primary advantage is that the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God, the divine revelations and teachings contained in the scriptures. This unique privilege signifies that the Jews have a special role in God's redemptive plan, as they were the first recipients of God's revealed word. Verses 3 to 4. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though every one were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words, and prevail when you are judged. Paul anticipates a potential objection. If some Jews were unfaithful, does that invalidate God's faithfulness? He emphatically rejects this notion, asserting that human unbelief cannot negate God's faithfulness. Paul quotes Psalm 51 verse 4 to underscore that God remains just and true, regardless of human failings. This affirmation highlights the unchanging nature of God's character and his commitment to his promises, despite human shortcomings. It reinforces the idea that God's faithfulness is intrinsic and independent of human actions. Verses 5 to 8. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. Paul addresses another potential misunderstanding. If human unrighteousness serves to highlight God's righteousness, does that make God unjust for judging sinners? Paul clarifies that this is a flawed, human way of thinking. He asserts that if God were unjust in his judgment, he could not rightly judge the world. God's justice is essential to his nature and his role as the ultimate judge. Paul then tackles a hypothetical argument. If human falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and brings him glory, why should a person still be condemned as a sinner? Some might even twist this logic to suggest that doing evil could be justified if it results in good. Paul decisively rejects this perverse reasoning, affirming that those who argue in such a way deserve condemnation. This underscores the importance of moral integrity and the rejection of any notion that could justify sinning for the sake of a perceived greater good. Let's summarize this section. In verses 1 to 8, Paul addresses key questions about the role and advantage of the Jews, the faithfulness of God despite human unfaithfulness, and the nature of God's righteousness and justice. He affirms that while the Jews had the privilege of receiving God's revelations, human unfaithfulness does not diminish God's faithfulness. Furthermore, he refutes any argument that suggests God is unjust in his judgment or that evil can be justified if it leads to a greater good. Through this, Paul emphasizes the unchanging righteousness of God and the integrity of his judgment, setting the stage for his subsequent discussions on sin and justification by faith. Now, let's pass to the second section, verses 9 to 20. All are under sin. Verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. Paul concludes his argument about the human condition by stating that neither Jews nor Gentiles have any advantage when it comes to sin. All are under its power. This universal condition of sinfulness means that no group can claim moral superiority or exemption from God's judgment. This verse serves as a summary of Paul's preceding arguments, emphasizing the pervasive nature of sin across all humanity. Paul quoting several Old Testament scriptures for verses 10 to 18. Let's read it all. As it is written, "None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." Paul supports his claim of universal sinfulness by quoting several Old Testament scriptures. These verses paint a comprehensive picture of human depravity. Let's delve deeper into verses 10 to 18. Each verse illustrates different aspects of humanity's moral and spiritual failings. Verse 10. Paul begins with a sweeping declaration of universal unrighteousness. By stating not even one, he leaves no room for exceptions, underscoring that all humans are inherently flawed in their moral standing before God. This quote is primarily drawn from Psalms 14 verses 1 to 3 and Psalms 53 verses 1 to 3. Verse 11. This verse highlights humanity's lack of spiritual insight and inclination. Without divine intervention, people do not naturally seek after God or grasp his truth. This lack of understanding is not merely intellectual but spiritual and moral. Verse 12. Here, Paul emphasizes the collective deviation from God's path, leading to moral and spiritual corruption. The term worthless suggests futility or failure to fulfill God's intended purpose for humanity. The repetition of no one who does good reinforces the comprehensive nature of human sinfulness. Verse 13. Paul uses vivid imagery to describe the destructive power of sinful speech. An open grave suggests death and decay, indicating that what comes out of their mouths is corrupt and defiling. Deception and poisonous speech symbolize the harm and malice that words can inflict. Verse 14. This further illustrates the negative use of speech, showing that it is not only deceitful and harmful, but also filled with cursing and bitterness. These expressions reflect inner moral decay and hostility toward others. Verse 15. This phrase highlights the eagerness and readiness of people to engage in violence. It portrays a proactive inclination towards harmful actions rather than accidental or reluctant participation in wrongdoing. Verse 16. The consequences of such violent behavior are ruin and misery. This describes the destructive impact of human sinfulness on individuals and society, leading to widespread suffering and chaos. Verse 17. Despite the suffering caused by their actions, people fail to pursue peace. This lack of peace signifies a fundamental disconnection from God's will, as true peace is found only in alignment with God's purposes. Verse 18. This concluding verse identifies the root cause of all the preceding sins, the absence of the fear of God. Reverence for God is the foundation of moral behavior, and without it, people are prone to all forms of unrighteousness. The fear of God is not merely terror but a deep respect and acknowledgement of God's authority and holiness. Verses 10 to 18 present a stark and comprehensive picture of human depravity, using a compilation of Old Testament scriptures to underscore various aspects of sin. Paul's intent is to demonstrate that sin affects every part of human existence, thoughts, words, and deeds, and that this pervasive sinfulness leaves no one righteous before God. This passage sets the stage for his subsequent argument about the necessity of God's righteousness revealed through faith in Jesus Christ, as human efforts are entirely insufficient to achieve righteousness. Paul shifts the focus to the role of the law in the next two verses, verses 19 and 20. Paul clarifies the purpose and limitations of the Mosaic Law in the context of God's plan for humanity. These verses reveal that the law serves to expose human sinfulness and make all people accountable to God. By doing so, the law demonstrates that no one can achieve righteousness through their own efforts, underscoring the need for divine grace and justification through faith. This pivotal section sets the stage for understanding the necessity of faith in Jesus Christ for salvation. Verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. This verse emphasizes that the Mosaic Law speaks to those under its jurisdiction, primarily the Jews, to demonstrate their guilt and silence any self-justification. By revealing God's standards, the law shows that everyone, both Jews and Gentiles, is accountable to God. This verse underscores the universal nature of sin and the inability of the law to justify anyone, highlighting humanity's need for God's grace. Verse 20. For by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Verse 20 states that no one can be declared righteous by observing the law, as its primary role is to make people aware of their sin. The law reveals human shortcomings and the pervasive nature of sin, demonstrating that righteousness cannot be attained through human effort, but requires God's grace. Verses 19 to 20 highlight the critical role of the Mosaic Law in God's redemptive plan. These verses clarify that the law was not given as a means to achieve righteousness, but to expose human sinfulness and hold everyone accountable before God. By revealing the depth of human failure to meet God's standards, the law silences all claims to self-righteousness and underscores the universal need for grace. This sets the stage for the subsequent revelation of justification through faith in Jesus Christ, demonstrating that true righteousness comes from God, not from human efforts. We will continue to study the remaining sections of the chapter in the next video. God bless you. If you are inspired by the Word of God, subscribe to the channel to get timely teachings and share with others.